Hey everybody, this is Volts for Wednesday, March 11, 2026. Is that brand new city in California for real? I'm your host, David Roberts. About halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento, roughly an hour's drive on state highways from either, is the proposed site of, depending on who you ask, either a bold attempt to show that America can still do big things, or an ill-fated vanity project for America's oligarchs. Up there in Solano County, a group of billionaire financiers organized under the banner California Forever wants to construct a brand new city that would eventually, if all goes according to the 40-year plan, host 400,000 residents, a giant advanced manufacturing park, and a fully functioning shipyard. It would be roughly half the size and have roughly half the population of San Francisco itself. Its location would be decidedly exurban, but according to the plans, the city itself would be laid out along positively dreamy urbanist lines, featuring a dense, walkable grid served by frequent transit. A third of the land would be turned over to park space and greenways. It would be heated by a district heating system. Is it for real? It's at least real enough that last month, California Forever signed the largest construction labor agreement in history with local unions, mandating that all construction on the 70,000 acres owned by California Forever be done through individual project labor agreements. As you can imagine, the plan has attracted an enormous amount of controversy. Critics charge that the location guarantees a regional traffic nightmare, that the proposed shipyard has no chance of happening, and that businesses will have no reason to relocate themselves 50 miles away from the already existing concentration of people and talent in San Francisco. Lots of folks will tell you this is a scheme by billionaires to buy up some cheap land and flip it, or a scheme to build a city that they can control like tyrants, more of a Blade Runner scenario. Jan Sramek, the CEO, founder, and for many years sole employee of California Forever, has been stumping for this plan for a decade now and has heard all the criticisms during the dozens of meetings and consultations he has conducted. In our conversation, which lasted almost 2.5 hours, we covered many of those objections and, geez, so much else. Because it went on for so long, I have decided for the first time ever to split this into 2 episodes. Today's episode will cover the big overview questions. Why build here rather than somewhere else? Why build something new rather than infill? What type of city do you envision? In the second episode, which will be out on Friday, we will cover more concrete details of how everything will work in practice, including transit, walkability, governance, and permitting. It is all a lot to take in, and it is quite difficult, even after going through all this, to know what to think about all of it. But this one I'll leave up to you, so I'm very curious to hear from you what you think after you've heard these episodes. So, enjoy! With no further ado, Jan Sramek, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
It's great to be here. That was a hell of an introduction. I'm excited for this discussion.
Jan, I'm overwhelmed. This is like, the deeper I've gotten into this, the more I've realized there's so much here, so many angles, so many different approaches. I mean, building a big brand new city, turns out, is a very big and complicated thing. There's like a million different ways I could come at this. I'll tell you, in one of your presentations, you described the layout of the city as an American street grid plus Barcelona superblocks plus Dutch woonerfs. And if it were up to me, in my heart, we would just sit contemplating that beautiful sentence for a whole hour. I would just talk about nothing
You and I both.
I know. That's what I really want to get to. That's the stuff. But there's a lot of other stuff I feel like we should at least touch on. first. So, backing up, let's start with why here? Why this piece of land? The biggest controversies, as far as I can tell, trace back to here, the choice of this particular spot. So, why not, for instance, find a small city somewhere else and just grow it? Why not grow in an existing city? Why not, if you're genuinely building something that's going to be self-sufficient or close to it and not going to be a bedroom committee, going to be a self-sufficient city, why not just go really far out in the middle of nowhere? Tell us why this chunk of land is the right chunk of land.
It's a really good way of phrasing that question. I would say I have generally been kind of the harshest critic of this idea. I didn't, you said building a new city is this crazy endeavor that takes decades and an incredible amount of capital and perseverance. And I didn't embark on it lightly. And so all of the criticisms that we've heard over the years were very much on my mind when I spent a year in the very beginning convincing myself that I wasn't completely insane to want to do this. And that comes to the question of location as well. So you can break down your question into three components. There's why can't we do it all with infill? Number one.
Right.
Then number two, should you do a 20-acre project at the edge of an existing city or a 50-acre project? And then number three, if you're going to build a new city, should you just do it in the middle of New Mexico?
Right.
And so I'll take them one by one. On the infill question, I spent about a year in 2015, 2016 actually working on that. And so I spent about a year working on a range of ideas, commercial ideas, about how do we build a lot more in existing cities. And the depressing conclusion of that work was that infill would be incredibly important and hopefully the majority of the solution in California. But it couldn't do all of it. It was just no way when you consider the amount of land that you needed, the politics, the pricing, the complexity of permitting it.
Well, certainly nothing this big, right? I mean, you could do a little infill project.
You could do infill projects, absolutely. But I would say it's been borne out in the data. I remember in 2017 when I started, Jerry Brown signed a package of 23 housing bills, and all of the headlines read, Jerry Brown signs a package of 23 housing bills to end the housing crisis. And they were all about infill, and we really followed this principle. And home prices in California have doubled in the last 10 years. And so clearly that alone isn't working. And again, I think the work that we've done and California YIMBY has done and YIMBY Action have done and the abundance movement more broadly has been super important. And many of the laws have been passed, the landmark laws have been passed quite recently. And so they will only get into production later. But it's still, we're missing 3 million housing units. We're building 50,000 a year once you deduct ADUs. And so it's very hard to see how we get there. And the other part of it is you look at many of those 50,000 units that we built are actually greenfield. There's a lot of construction happening in the Central Valley. There's a lot of construction happening in Solano County. There's construction happening in all sides of our property. Rio Vista is expanding from the east side, Fairfield and Vacaville and Dixon from the west and from the north side. And so what my insight, I think, was greenfield is happening. 86% of housing that is being built in America today is greenfield.
Yikes.
So if it's already happening, can we make it better? Can we make it walkable? Because if we do that, then number one, we build much better places that have a lower environmental footprint. But also, if we make them walkable, we can put 4 times as many people on the same acre. And so we can keep a lot more of the nature open space.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just say here, just to throw in here, is if you go drive around that area of California, I mean, no offense at all to the people who live there, but like the way that land is currently being developed is very characteristic of the way greenfield is developing across the United States, which is not quite cities, right? Like sort of like villages, but they're not quite big enough to be self-sufficient. They're all sort of like bedroom communities. So you just get these sort of car-dependent little kind of smears of development that never quite amount to a city. And you just get a bunch of those kind of scattered around. It's just like the worst, like the extant way that land is developing is terrible, I would just say.
I think that's true all over America. And I think the way that I would put it is I have come to respect and kind of recognize the fact that some people really like that and they want to live in it. And I think that's fine. But I think it's a balance, right? And I think what we have today is 86%, 90% of the development in America is exactly that today.
Yeah.
Actually, probably more than that. And then on the other side, you have 5/1 or high rises in cities where most of the units are studios and 1 bedrooms, where it's very difficult to have a family. And I think that the missing middle phenomenon is real. So in Solano County, for example, the numerical numbers supporting what you said is in the last 40 years, Solano County developed 20,000 acres into development, virtually all of it suburban development. About 11,000 acres of that was prime farmland. And most of it is, as I mentioned, is suburban developments. And so our proposal and by the way, no jobs. 68% of the people in the county commute.
Yeah, that's the problem, right?
Exactly.
If you just have a few shops and houses, you just don't get the agglomeration you need to create like a center of gravity. That's the problem with those developments, is they're never quite enough to form a center of gravity and grow. So they just kind of stay not quite fish, not quite fowl, not quite suburban, not quite city, just not quite anything. A lot of that in Washington too.
That gets yeah, and that gets exactly to your question about kind of scale and location. And so people say some of what makes this scary to people is the scale of it. It's the scale of the land holdings, it's the scale of the capital, it's the scale of the entitlement that we asked for upfront. And the reason for why we did that was all at the very foundation of the business model and the business plan, which is people have tried to build walkable neighborhoods before, and there's been some successes, and the new urbanists have built some really great communities, but they are mostly like smaller resort towns or vacation towns. And then every developer comes in and says, well, we're going to bring jobs to the project. And it rarely happens. And I think a lot of that is to do with scale, because, for example, if you want to build a true city that has walkable densities and that has jobs, you need the scale to, for example, nobody wants to live in a row house or an apartment building in the middle of fields unless you have retail. But the retail doesn't make money in the early days. So the only way that you make that work is you basically subsidize it in the early days. And you can only subsidize it if you're building something very large where you can eventually recover the cost. It's the same for employment. I mean, we've done, I think, a tremendous job. The reason why Solano County doesn't have jobs right now is it's a bedroom community for Sacramento and it's a bedroom community for the Bay Area. And there's been reports written in the county year after year about how important is it to bring employers. And nothing has happened in 40 years. In fact, the situation has gone backwards. So right now, there's been a perfect storm in the last 3 months where 5 of the major employers in Solano County have announced they are closing. 5. And it's these old world industries, like there's a big brewery that is closing because Anheuser-Busch is consolidating operations. And I think a big part of the reason for why employers didn't come is that it's what you said. It's someone took 100 acres at the edge of a city and they built a subdivision, and then they built another one, and then they built another one. And so nobody ever really had an incentive or the ability to do what we've done, which is at our scale, we can afford to master plan it, and we can afford to spend a lot of money and hire a lot of really, really great people who care about it to go and market Solano County all over America and say, this is a great place to do business. You should come here. And then we can combine that with, you can imagine if you go to an employer and you say, why don't you build a factory to build advanced manufacturing or ships or whatever it is in California, they generally say 2 things. Where are the employees going to live? And how about permitting? And at our scale, what we're able to say is, we will deal with the permitting. We will get you a site where the only thing you need to do is get a building permit. So that unlocks the conversation. And then the second thing we say is, this is a new place and you're taking a risk on a new location. There's a lot of really great people who live here and they commute every morning to Mountain View for 2 hours. They don't want to do that. You'll be able to get great people. And by the way, for your future employees, we're getting entitlement to build 174,000 homes over the next 40 years. So you know this isn't going to be a situation where you come here, you start growing, and then suddenly house prices skyrocket because there's not enough housing. And so the whole thing is this kind of deeply integrated ecosystem between jobs and housing and infrastructure that makes it work.
I want to pull out one point you just made. Because you are a master developer for a very, very large project, you're dealing with very large sums of money, which means you can afford to subsidize the amenities that are going to make living in the dense housing livable and attractive. You're describing a chicken and egg problem that faces a lot of these developments everywhere they go. Like you want the jobs and the housing and the manufacturing all to kind of come at once, but like as you say, you just end up sort of building a subdivision and hoping the others show up. But because you are dealing with such large sums of money, you can lose a little money up front to front load the amenities that get people to come. And then once you I heard you discussing this on another pod, there's this concept of a minimum viable scale for a community. And I think what happens to these developments at the edge of town that you're discussing, and we're all familiar with them, they're popping up in a lot of different cities, is they don't quite reach the scale necessary where they get on this sort of positive feedback loop, and can sustain themselves. There's just not quite enough there to get it going. So what you're talking about is front loading those amenities, spending up front to make sure that even the very first people who get there have something like a community. Is that a fair way of summarizing that?
100%. That's 100% the insight, and that's 100% the answer for why we've master planned. I mean, that's one of the answers for why we've master planned the entire project, and we're saying we need the clarity on the entitlements upfront because we want to be able to make investments that nobody else would make in transit and retail and schools and parks that we can make if we know that we can build for 40 years and have patient capital that eventually recovers those returns. But that's very hard to do on a smaller scale. There's a second component to it. So this is to do with kind of overcoming the cold start problem or the chicken and egg problem that you described.
Right.
There's a second component to this, which is, I would say, as important, which is by internalizing a lot of the externalities. Even once it gets going, we can make decisions that are in the best interest of the investments that are in the best interest of the community that individually you couldn't make. For example, if we are building the entirety of the project and we probably end up owning some of the industrial buildings or some of the office buildings or some of the rental buildings, then we have a real incentive to go and spend a little bit of money, continue to spend a little bit of money subsidizing the retail or making the park nicer, or investing in transportation, or continuing to do economic development.
And this is a classic problem in cities. Is like if you as a developer pay to make a park better, a lot of the value of that investment goes to other people, the other people who are enjoying the park. You know what I mean? So you don't capture all the value of that investment. So you will tend to underinvest in those type of things. But if you are the master planner and you own the whole thing, then anything that improves the ambiance for anyone is a benefit to you, basically. So all those externalities, you're absorbing the positive ones too.
Exactly, and we're helping to overcome. It's kind of tragedy of the commons in some sense, right? Or it's a collective action problem where you have a retail shopping street and it doesn't quite make sense for anyone to go and put up Christmas lights because if they just do it on their store, then it doesn't create the ambiance. And so you can either have a kind of merchants association, which is how it happens in some places, or you can have someone who owns 20 or 30% of the stores, and then it makes sense for them to go and make those investments. And it also really aligns us, I think, with the community for the long run, where if you have a developer who's coming in and they're building 500 homes at the edge of a city, they can come in and make all kinds of promises around how they're going to improve transportation and how they're going to build transit and how they're going to build a coffee shop. But the reality is, by the time that they've sold home number 500, in fact, by the time that they've sold home 400 or something, they don't really care. Like if the roads start cracking and the park doesn't work and the coffee shop closes, they don't care.
And this is precisely what a lot of people in the county fear that you're doing. A lot of people fear that you're buying this cheap land because it was protected agricultural land, so it was pretty cheap. You buy it all up, you're going to flip it to commercial, sell it to make a profit, and then bail, and then it will, like, none of these promises will pay off. This is very much the fear. So I'm happy to hear you address this square on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's two answers to it. So it was 100% the fear of a lot of the people in the beginning. I think a few different answers to it. The first one is, to what I was just saying, what we've told people, and they've started to see the logic of it, is I said, look, if we make all of these promises and then we build 2,000 homes and the place is awful and we don't improve the transportation and we don't bring any jobs, we still have 95% of our homes to sell. Like we haven't even started to recover. We haven't even started to recover the investment. And so unless we do a really good job where a lot of people, when I come in and move in and the place works, it's very hard for us to make any money. That's part number one. And that's the same, by the way, for anyone else building there. And we have no intent of getting it approved and then flipping it. I don't know that there's even someone who would want to be buying it after you do that. I mean, it's such a large project. You need such an amount of investment to get it off the ground. That's part one. Part two is we said, look, we get that a lot of developers come in and they make promises and then they break them. And in some sense, the way that it felt in the beginning when we introduced it is we kind of got saddled with all of the disappointment that happened over the years by other developers who came in and made promises.
That plus the more modern hostility toward tech billionaires, right? I mean, there's a lot of that hanging around too. And we should say you began all this by buying this land in stealth mode, basically. Like you had a bunch of investors, you created a bunch of sort of kind of front companies that bought all this stuff up and did not reveal what you were doing until you owned all the land. Now, I can sort of see the logic why you did that. Like, this thing isn't going to work unless you own all the contiguous land. And if you told people what you were doing while you were doing it, it would be easy for someone to come in and just buy a piece of land in the middle and block you. But I think you can also see why the residents being presented with this, hey, guess what? We now own most of your county. You can understand some initial suspicion and resistance, right?
Oh, 100%. And I mean, we fully expected that when we introduced this would be very controversial. And what I told people in the beginning, from the moment that I walked into the first town hall, I said, I understand all of the reservations. The only thing I'm asking is keep an open mind. I know you have all of these questions.
Right.
Who are you? Why are you doing this? What are you going to build? How are you going to protect the infrastructure? Where does the water come from? All I'm saying is keep an open mind. Let us answer the questions. Let us get you the documents. Let us bring the companies and keep an open mind. So that's the starting point. The second thing that I'll say is we've certainly made our share of mistakes when rolling it out. And there's no playbook for how do you introduce something this big. I mean, we haven't built a new city in America in 60, 70 years. And so we certainly could have done a bunch of things better, and we've taken responsibility for that. I think on the substance of the different points that you mentioned, I want to unpack three of them one by one. So the first one was on the empty developer promises. A lot of people changed their mind when we said, we're going to bring jobs. And they said, well, every developer says that. And we said, well, what if we're willing to guarantee that? What if we're willing to say that the approvals are kind of lockstep, where we get an approval to build X number of homes, but unless we've delivered an X number of jobs, then we're not allowed to build any more homes. And we said, okay, nobody's ever agreed to that before. Fine.
Wait, so that's a legal agreement in place?
It's being discussed right now. We had it in the ballot initiative in the first version of it. Was the guarantee number one. We called it a jobs guarantee. It was a legally binding agreement where the county literally wasn't allowed to issue a building permit over a certain number of homes until we've delivered a certain number of jobs.
Interesting.
The other, by the way, on the guarantees, I would say when we first rolled it out, the YIMBY movement was divided on this, and a lot of people were skeptical. And what I've learned is a big part of the skepticism is people felt like, okay, you're going to paint this new urbanist walkable vision, you're going to get it approved, and then you're going to get it watered down and just basically build suburbia.
Yes.
And we heard that, and what we've put in the documents, and it was in the ballot initiative, and it's in the current set of documents again. We are the only project I'm aware of in America on a greenfield that has agreed not to a maximum density, but to a minimum density.
That made my hair stand up, so I swear to God. So your zoning officially, I mean, I guess none of this is really official or legal yet because the thing doesn't exist yet. But the idea is most people will be familiar with zoning that gives you a maximum number of units you can put on a lot, residential units you can put on a lot. Your zoning has a minimum number of residential. And what is that number?
So that's correct. The number is 20 units in the majority of the project and then 30 units in the downtown.
Per acre? Or?
Per acre. And those numbers are not artificial. They are taken from California government code, where those have been defined as what the state considers to be affordable by design. It's basically missing middle housing. So in urban counties in California, 30 units per acre is considered affordable by design. And in the rest of California, it's 20 units per acre. And by the way, our density overall, when you run it across the entirety of the city, we come in just between Boston and San Francisco. So that's the overall density on the project.
That's interesting to me because I would have thought with 400,000 people, and if the entire city is laid out in this dense way, I guess I would have thought that the density would be higher than most American cities.
It is.
I mean, I guess Boston is kind of more dense than most American cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ranking especially for larger cities in America, is literally New York, San Francisco, and Boston, and so it will be the third.
So you'll be in the
third densest,
top three densest.
Top three, exactly. I wanted to come back to just a couple of points that you made earlier on the confidential land assembly. Again, 100%. We knew that this would cause concerns, and people ask, well, why did you have to do it this way? And the answer is there's a legitimate kind of commercial reason for doing it, as you mentioned. And it was just us walking people through why we did it, showing, hey, this is how it happens everywhere. When a university is buying land, they do the same thing. And then also explaining, we paid 4 times market value on average to everyone who sold. And then oftentimes, on top of that, people have been able to stay on the property for 5, 10, 15, 20 years for free. We pay their property taxes, and we've been able to bring in to the community people who've sold to us and who said, this was a great deal. This was a better deal than I ever dreamed I could get. This was life-changing money for my family. We have a good relationship. So that worked. The last point I want to make is on the billionaire investors question. And a couple of points on that. The first one is, there was a sense, if you read the press reports when this came out, you would have thought that like billionaires got together in a smoke-filled room and they decided to build a new city. The reality is like Jan spent a year convincing himself I wasn't insane to want to work on it. Then I tried to go raise money. Then nobody would give me money, but I believed in it so much that I went out and I took personal loans to get it off the ground. And then my belief was that the only people who would back it and who would be able to take a 20 or 30-year view were billionaires, were family offices and very long-term investment funds. You couldn't take this to a private equity fund or to a bank. And like, can you imagine the reaction?
Is there private capital that will be like, here, pay me back in 30, 40 years or whatever? Like, I mean, as you say, we haven't done anything like this in 60 or 70 years. So like none of the institutional machinery is built.
There's very few people who could do that. Exactly. And by the way, convincing every one of those people to invest was very, very difficult. And I started a company in 2017. In 2017, the criticism from a lot of the media and significant part of society overall to billionaires was, why do you guys have to keep funding these stupid messaging apps that don't really do anything? Why don't you take your money and fund some real companies that solve real issues for real families? Yes. And I was there raising this money. And so when it came out, I felt it was unfair because I said, look, you've been telling them to do this. You've been telling them like fund stuff that nobody else would fund that improves lives for people. And we went to people who did that. And the way that it ties to the community is, and I've kind of had this conversation with hundreds of people in Solano County, and I think a lot of people have started to see it. I said, would you rather this is funded by a bank or a private equity firm that is demanding a return in 7 years and we have to cut all of these corners, or someone who can take a 30-year view?
Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show.
Would you rather this is funded by a bank or a private equity firm that is demanding a return in 7 years and we have to cut all of these corners, or someone who can take a 30-year view?
Right, like that's the dynamic that drives these disappointing other projects you're talking about, where they make big promises, build a little thing, and then bail, because that's the short-term returns they're not getting, right? I mean, there is a certain scale where you have to have long-term capital, and we just don't think in terms of long-term capital in this country anymore. I don't know if it's sad or not that you have to go to billionaires to find that, but it is true that there are not many places to find it.
I think we should solve the capital market problem, and we should have patient long-term capital. And I think there's stuff happening in this space, and more people are able to do it. The other part of it is, if you look at many of the most walkable, beloved neighborhoods, particularly in Europe, they were built by wealthy families. I mean, the great estates of London, right? Like Holborn and Belgravia and Kensington. I mean, these were generational projects by wealthy families. And part of the reason for why they are incredible is people cared about what they were building because it wasn't just about money.
Right. And there's a holistic approach too, because they own the whole thing. So they want the whole thing.
Exactly. So they could make those long-term decisions. And I've told people, look, we don't shy away from the fact that this is a for-profit company. We never tried to pretend like this was some kind of a foundation. But the reality is, for virtually every one of our investors, there's a reason for why they invested beyond money. Now, it's different. I mean, you look at someone like the Collison brothers or Nat Friedman, they really care about urbanism and walkability and great design. You might look at someone like Laureen Jobs, and she cares about economic opportunity and education. But there's a reason to invest beyond money. And I think when you look at it rationally, none of these people want to be attached to some crappy subdivision in the middle of nowhere. This isn't their biggest investment. This isn't some AI investment that's going to make some crazy multiple. This is a good long-term investment where I think people want to look back at it in 30 years and say, we helped fund something spectacular. And I understand all of the skepticism that people have about it. To be clear, I'm not naive about it, but I do think there's a lot going for being funded this way rather than being funded by a publicly listed company that has to make quarterly earnings or by a private equity firm.
I mean, you could make the argument that if these billionaires just wanted to make money, there's a lot easier and lower profile ways to make money than this.
100%.
And they're also drowning in money. Like, I can imagine them fooling themselves about some things or failing for various reasons, but it would be weird to me. Like, I've read a bunch of this paranoid stuff about this project, but I just can't make it click in my head. Like, if I'm a billionaire and I want to make money, this would be just the most Baroque, roundabout,
exactly
difficult. I mean, of all the ways I could make money as a billionaire, this would be the most roundabout possible way to do it. So clearly the people involved have more than that on their mind.
Yeah, look, and the last thing that I'll say on this, and then let's talk about the urban design, but the last thing that I'll say, that also applies to me. I mean, I spent the first 2 years of my life after college being a trader at Goldman Sachs. Everyone reported that in the media. I was really good at it. There's a lot of easier ways to make money. Do you know what I left Goldman to do? I left Goldman to run an education company. I spent 4 years of my life running an education company before I did this. And so there's a lot of easier ways to make money, I think, for everyone involved here. This is a passion project.
Before we get to the urban design, one final question about this. So you said there's 3 views on the land. One, why you didn't just do infill. The second, why you didn't just build a big development on the edge of an existing development. But then there's the question of sort of why this particular piece of land. You do have some things to say about the advantage of this geographically and in terms of land value. Just quickly run through that.
Yeah. So on the second point, by the way, of expanding an existing city, that's also worth stating. That's what we're doing right now.
Yeah,
and
but
so the way that the permitting and the governance is going to work now at a very large scale.
You're not really though. Like this is. I mean, I don't know how much we want to talk about this, but it's very interesting. So initially, you were going to do an unincorporated development in the middle of the county. There was going to be a ballot initiative. It became very clear that the ballot initiative was going to lose. That the people of Solano County did not want you to do that. So you said, okay, well, we'll be municipal then. We will be an expansion of an existing city. And so you're doing that with this little city, Suisun, about 30,000 people, about 5 square miles. But the thing is, Suisun is landlocked. And between Suisun and where you are going to build is this Travis Air Force Base that you cannot build directly south of because of flight plans. So this city that you're expanding, I'm using air quotes here, it's still going to be Suisun City sitting over here, and then several miles of undeveloped corridor, and then a giant city over here. So you see, like, legally, that's an expansion of Suisun. But like geographically, like culturally, it's not really. And I would like to hear how you think that's going to work to have a small city of 30,000 people where the seat of government sits governing 450,000 people that live a few miles down the road. Like, how is that whole arrangement supposed to work? It's odd. I think you will concede.
So you said well, it's only a legal arrangement. Geographically, they're going to have some distance between them. I would posit that that's the main thing that people cared about.
Huh.
The main thing people cared about is they wanted to know that people liked the land use plan. The land use plan hasn't really changed since the initiative. And they kind of told us that everyone was like, we have no issue with the land use plan. I mean, there was a debate about the size of it, but the land use plan itself and the location, generally speaking, people liked. What they really cared about was, we don't want it to be a new tech city. We want you to go into an existing governance framework. And so I think that actually really mattered.
I guess I don't fully understand why, though. Like, why? I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. This gets into the sort of like internal politics of the county. And
I mean, I think it's bigger than the county. I mean, look, even what we proposed initially in the unincorporated county, the governing body would have been the Board of Supervisors. The law enforcement agency would have been the sheriff. So this was never some kind of a crazy private city with some different level of governance. But people just felt like if an existing city controls it, then that's the best outcome. And then I will say, I mean, the story of a smaller city that does a very large expansion that over time becomes bigger than the original city, that's not new. I mean, you look at Barcelona that you and I have talked about. The expansion in Barcelona is bigger than the Gothic Quarter where it all started.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's unusual now.
But they're not geographically separated, though.
Fair enough.
I mean, they're in the same spot.
And I think there's an open question of how exactly that will work in terms of connectivity and transit and so on. So you were asking about the larger area. I think there's the question of why not to do it in the middle of New Mexico. And I think the answer is the way that new cities have generally failed in the past is there's no demand. And governments can make people go in the middle of nowhere. Hence, we have Brasilia and places like that. But you're fighting demand. And I've been very influenced by thinking of cities as networks, effectively. Kind of the same way that you have a social network or you have a marketplace of merchants. And so proximity matters. And I think it's a lot easier to start a city that extends an existing network, which in our case is both Bay Area and Sacramento, from both sides, than trying to start something completely in the middle of nowhere. And then this particular location, the part that is relevant is this has been in regional plans done by the federal government as well as the regional government, ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. This has been slated as a location for actually two new cities, going all the way back to 1958. And they both, the Federal Commerce Department, the Army Corps of Engineers, and then later ABAG, basically said this is a place to build one or two new cities. And they both also concluded that this wouldn't happen until sometime in the 2000s or 2010s. So they correctly predicted that urbanization would take its course in the kind of inner bay. Eventually, we would need a bit more space, and this would be a good location for that. In fact, it goes back to the discussion we had earlier when you were talking about how incremental development rarely will produce kind of great urbanism or jobs. ABAG has the Bay Area Plan 1970-1990. And in it, they literally say, towards the end of this period, so in the 90s, we're going to run out of space and the area is going to become unaffordable unless we build new cities. And we should reserve areas that they called controlled development, large areas of land, where we shouldn't permit piecewise small development, so that we can master plan them and build new cities that have they wanted to build at least 5 new cities that have at least 100,000 people each, where you can have well-planned infrastructure and jobs housing balance. And then if you look at where in the 9-county Bay Area, from San Jose all the way up to Solano, they believed was the best and biggest site to do controlled development, it was southeastern Solano County by a factor of about 5. And so the land that we own is basically 90% of the area that ABAG described as being suitable for this 56 years ago. And the reason for why they believe that is if you looked at all of the factors that matter for where you should be developing, height above sea level, fire risk, seismic risk, the quality of the soil, i.e. you want to be developing on the least productive soil, the diversity of the ecological ecosystem that is there, you want to be developing on the least ecologically valuable area. Based on all of those factors, they concluded this was the best site to do this in the Bay Area. And those are the factors that I looked at.
Pull out that point about fire real quick, because I do think that's significant, because it's obviously something that's on people's minds when it comes to California. But this location, there's water on two sides. There's a big marsh on one side, and then there's grasslands on the other side. So you're not at the, what's it called?
The wildland urban interface?
Yes, thank you. You're not at where the forest and people meet, basically, where all the fires happen. I guess you can have grass fires, but it's not nearly as big of a risk. So you're sort of uniquely fire resistant relative, I guess, to the rest of California.
100%. I mean, there are grass fires that happen in the area, but grass fires are very easy to manage because they don't have high combustible load. The other part of it on fire, by the way, is the building code has gotten so good in the last 20 or 30 years that master planned communities in California, even in areas where they are surrounded by forests, they never burn. Master planned communities, to my knowledge and to everything that I've seen from our fire consultants and everyone else, there is no master planned community in California that was built in the last 20 years that burned. In fact, they often become places of refuge for the fire crews when they come in, because the building code has gotten so strict that these places are very, very hard to ignite. And so when you layer in the location where we are not in one of those high-risk areas, and then on top of it, we can design the whole thing from scratch with sprinklers and systems and materials that don't easily inflate, it's probably going to be one of the most fire-resilient places in California, which is also true for sea level rise, by the way.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. It's close to water, but nonetheless quite elevated.
Yeah, very elevated. I mean, the lowest, I think generally speaking, the city is about 20 to, I think lowest point is 20 up to about 160 feet above sea level. And I do know that if you assume a medium aggressive sea level rise scenario through 2150, not 2050, 2150, so the next 125 years of sea level rise, and then you assume that you have a 100-year flood in that condition layered on top of the 174,000 homes that we are building, 0 of them get flooded in that condition. 0.
And no tectonic faults.
Which matters a great deal for shipbuilders, by the way, and for other big manufacturers. That's the other thing. If you're going to build a $2 billion dry dock that has millions of tons of concrete, building it on top of an earthquake fault line like you have in Bremerton or Hawaii versus in Solano makes it twice as expensive to build it in those places than where we are.
All right. I really want to get to the urbanism, so I'm just going to have to bracket water. My apologies to all the people who hassled me to ask you about water. I think it is your position that you have all the water permits necessary.
Can I give you the 1-minute answer on water?
Yeah.
We have secured all the water for the full build out, including all of the residences and all of the non-residential space. As part of the environmental work, the city is going to be publishing what's called a water supply assessment that's going to have 1,000+ pages of detail. The short version of the story is we own about 8,000 acres of irrigated pasture northeast of the city that has appropriative rights to the Sacramento River. We're going to use that water for the city. Then we're going to use recycled water from the city to irrigate the pasture instead. So we don't even have to take that out of production because it's not crops, it's irrigated pasture. So you can use recycled water to do it. We then own about 4,000 acres of almonds. As you know, they use an insane amount of water. One almond uses 4 gallons of water to grow. And so we're going to take out the almonds, we're going to replace them with solar, and we're going to use that water instead, which is coming from the aquifer right now for the city. And then lastly, we've purchased the final slice for about the final 25%. We've purchased water rights from further up in the Sacramento Valley that are coming from conservation projects where people have taken out crops and they've turned land into habitat, which frees up water. We can use that water instead for the city. And then the purchase price from us to buy the water is contributing to those conservation projects. And then we wrap all of that up with one of the most sustainable designs for that infrastructure of any city in America, where I think we have about a 70% rate of recycling the water, which we are then using for landscaping, flushing toilets in some big buildings, parks, and then for irrigation of the pasture lands around it. And so it's very unusual for a project in California to have such a good story, but this is a unique location that makes all of that possible, and all the details will come out in the environmental work in the summer.
Well, Jan, this was supposed to be the prelude. Now we're 50 minutes into it.
I have time. I have time to go as long as you want.
Good, because there's so much more. So this is, I think, we could probably continue talking about this, but I think this gives a decent sense of why here, why the land, why a new city, why not infill, why not expand an existing city, and why locate right here. You got a body of water, you're pretty elevated, no earthquakes, low fire risk. It is, we should say, going to be hot as hell, but that's a problem lots of cities are going to have to deal with.
Can I just say one thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
So it has a climate that is close to Sacramento, not as hot as Sacramento, but it sits in the delta where in the summer between May and September, you have a steady prevailing wind coming off the ocean and heading into the Central Valley. And what we've done is we've oriented the street grid at a 45-degree angle to the prevailing wind so that we don't let it blast through the city, but we don't also completely slow it down. And so we pulling the trick that you find in places like the Greek islands, where they use the winds to basically cool off the cities by orienting the grid correctly, air-cooled. So it is going to be hot, but I think it's going to be a lot nicer than most places in California, other than the very, very coastal areas in the summer.
Okay, so let's talk about the urbanism then. Honestly, we could do a whole pod on the foundry, which is fascinating on its own right. Do a whole pod on the shipyard, fascinating on its own right, but I love urbanism and want to talk about it. So, when I first heard about this, I had the same reaction I think everybody has, because tech billionaires are on my mind, and not necessarily in a good way. But I have loved listening to you talk about urbanism. And particularly, what I find amusing is you have a story, a personal story, that echoes what I hear from so many people in the urbanism and YIMBY community, which is, I went to college in a nice place, and then I moved to the US, and I said, what the hell is this? And this is like a scarring experience that so many people I know have gone through. Same basically for me. Like I went and spent 10 days in Barcelona, and it basically ruined me.
It is very hard to come back from that.
So just talk briefly about your personal, you were born in Czechia and poor, and then worked your way up and ended up seeing a bunch of cities. So tell us briefly about your sort of urbanism tour in your life.
So I grew up in a small village of 1,000 people with decent, not great, but decent urbanism in the village. But then you had to take a bus, which wasn't very frequent, to go anywhere to see friends. So isolating in that environment. Then I got a scholarship to go to the UK, and I spent 10 years coincidentally just living in some of the best urbanism in the world. I lived in the Old York for 2 years. I lived in Old Cambridge in the UK. I lived in London, and then I lived in Zurich. And it was about 10 years. And it got to a point where in those 10 years, I never owned a car. Not once. I got a driving license when I was 17, but I never owned a car. I never really used the car regularly. And then in the last 3 years of it in Zurich, I did not physically get into a car once in 3 years, other than when I think we got a van to go to IKEA and bring back some furniture. I physically, in 3 years in Switzerland, I did not get into a car, which is just a totally, not an Uber, not a taxi, nothing in 3 years.
And I know this will resonate. The longer you go without getting in a car, the more getting in a car and getting on the road feels bizarre, like something humans should not be doing, right? Like you lose your familiarity with it. And then when you do it, you're like, what? Why would people do this all day long? Like it's really an awful experience that we are dulled to because we're so familiar with it. But like you leave it behind for a while and come back to it, you're like, man, cars suck.
100%, particularly for moving around within a city. I think in the US, I think the reality is between cities, we're probably going to have to get in a car a lot. But within a city, I think you are 100% right. And it's one of those like David Foster Wallace, what is water situations where you get used to it. And I think California Forever overall was made possible by the contrast, this very quick contrast between 10 years without a car, and then suburbia of the Bay Area. And
yeah, it's bad there. And you think living abroad, I mean, this is something I hear from a lot of people who come from other countries. Like you hear about Silicon Valley, like the glittering future, where the future is born, innovation, all the greatest minds. And then you go look at physical Silicon Valley, and it is so ugly and like squat and unpleasant, just like a smear of the grossest kind of suburbia. You're like, this is where the future is?
I think you're right. And I think it's a tremendous shame, because the way that I thought about it is these combinations of creativity and wealth and human capital and cultural openness and industry. I mean, that's what created Florence and Paris and London and New York and Chicago, right? Yeah. That's what funds the great urbanism and the museums and the architectural beauty and all of it. I was kind of sad when I got here, because I felt this is modern day Florence. This is what it should feel like. Like when you get here, it should feel like that. And it didn't. I mean, quick story. Just the first 36 hours for me in California ever. I mean, I grew up with this idea of this place could build anything, and optimism and sunshine. And then I get on a train, super clean, modern, cheap train in Switzerland. I got on a tram, I get on a train.
Swiss trains.
Yeah, they are as good as, you know what, actually, they are better than people say they are. I was radicalized by the experience of Switzerland. But like, I walked out of my apartment in Zurich, I got to the tram. I didn't look when the tram was leaving, because it was always there. I got on a tram, I changed the tram, I changed to a train, I got to the airport. That whole thing took 20 minutes. It was super pleasant. The airport was modern and beautiful. I got on a flight and I landed at SFO. And like a good European, I'm like, how do I get to San Francisco? And I went and I got on BART. And it was the moment when I got on BART that I looked around and I'm like, that's not what I expected. Okay. And then I get to San Francisco, which has a lot of beauty, and 40% of San Francisco is deeply walkable and incredible. Super expensive and unaffordable, but that's what it is. But it was, my experience with the car was so bad that I had a meeting on the peninsula in Silicon Valley on Monday, and I get here on Saturday. On the Sunday, I rented a zip car to just go drive around to make sure I could still physically drive a car, because I hadn't done it in like 8 years. And then I drove to Silicon Valley and I kept driving around like a crazy person and being like, where the hell is Silicon Valley?
Yes, there's no there. There's literally no there.
Is it Howard Kastner who has this book, The Geography of Nowhere?
Consular, yeah.
Where he talks about how so much of American life, unfortunately, is driving from nowhere to nowhere,
yes.
Looking for a place that is worth being in. And I think that's a tremendous shame. And that's what I would love to make a contribution to improving.
So this is where the podcast as an oral medium is a little bit of a liability. It would help people to be able to look a little bit at the plan. It's on the website. It's easy to go find. But basically, on the northwest side of the city, over by Travis Air Force Base, there's this big foundry. There's this big industrial park where businesses are going to come locate. And then like a couple miles south of the city is where the shipyard is allegedly going to be. And then the city itself is a big grid. There's a giant park straight up all the way through the middle of it, which, as if I heard you correctly, is bigger than Central Park, bigger than Golden Gate Park.
Exactly. The part of it that goes through the city itself is about as big as those two, and then it fans out in this expansive grassland that goes all the way to the Sacramento River, where once you add that, it's even bigger.
Right, and then all around that is a living space, grids. So you have there's a big downtown in the southwest, a big downtown, and then a little sort of what you'd call, I guess, an arts district or a makers district, a sort of Soho style place where you're going to, have warehouses and artists and all that kind of stuff. And then over on the other side, on the east side, there's another small downtown and small arts district. Two more small downtowns, as I think I recall. But basically the rest of it is a street grid. So describe the grid. It's sort of a layered architecture. Describe like starting at the smallest level and then sort of work out.
Anders Duaney, who was one of the founders, or is one of the founders of New Urbanism, described it as a tartan grid, which I thought was a really good name for it recently.
Tartan.
It looks like that kind of pattern, but We obsess about the street grid. Gabe Metcalf, who runs planning here, who was the longtime CEO of Spur in the Bay Area, for those who know it, myself and our head of urban design at a company called SiteLab, we have this kind of foundational belief that we all share, that the laying down of the street grid is the most profound decision that you make in the city. It's not the architecture, it's not the zoning, it's the laying of the street grid, because that's the thing that you can't change. The Manhattan street grid hasn't changed in 200 years and probably won't. So we've really, really obsessed about it. And I think in particular, what we've tried to find is the right set of trade-offs between walkability and cars. And Gabe and Laura have told me that I'm the only developer who's ever pushed their planning team to make it more walkable, not less, and kept pushing of like, how many more cars can we get out of it? They're like, this is unheard of. Nobody ever does this. Developers always want more cars. What are you doing? But we've really thought about it. And Jay Primus is our head of transportation on the team as well, and he's been deeply running that process. So maybe one more piece of context. We've been inspired by what the new urbanists have done in places starting with Seaside and Alice Beach and Ion and all of these wonderful developments all over America. The new problem that we had was a problem of scale and of movement. So most of these places that have been built that are wonderful new urbanist communities have maybe a few thousand people in them, maybe 10, 20,000 people at the edge of it, but really more like a few thousand, some of them only a few hundred. And what that means is you can design a system where people drive to the edge of the development and then they kind of walk wherever they need to go or bike. But we don't have that luxury. If you want a city for 400,000 people, you can't do that. And so the way that we've solved that, we believe, is we have a system of superblocks. So the whole city is a grid. It's about 7 miles east to west and about 4 miles north to south. And every half a mile to quarter mile, depending on where you are, there is what we call a movement street, which you can think of it as a boulevard. Now, very importantly, it is not an arterial road the way that American transportation engineers would describe it. A movement street, generally speaking, has one lane for cars, one lane for rapid transit, and we can talk about what that would be. It has a parking lane, it has a bike lane, and it has a sidewalk.
So we should just say these are the corridors, which means the biggest street will have one lane of car traffic in either direction.
That's correct.
There will be no 3-lane, 4-lane, no stroads.
100%. And then if you look at the width of those lanes, we've really pushed it down as well. And that was actually one of the pieces of feedback that came from the urbanist community and from the INBIC community when the first version of the plan came in 2024, where, I mean, Ezra and Derek talk about everything bagel liberalism. And we had everything bagel streets, where we tried to design a street that was like the widest sidewalk and a wide bike lane, and then a street, and then a wide lane of trees and landscaping, and they get very big. So we actually had an internal effort, it was called the street diet. And we worked on how do we narrow it down, because you want that feeling of enclosure and coziness. And we've now been through Street Diet 1.0 and then Street Diet 2.0. And now we're very proud of where we landed.
So every half mile is a corridor street like this, a boulevard.
Exactly. And then every quarter mile in between those is another street that has cars on it that can go a little bit faster. We're still working out on the speed limits, but a little bit faster. And so think of it this way. Inside every area that is half a mile by half a mile, those are the movement streets. And that's where transit runs, which means you are at most, on average 5, at most maybe 7-10 minutes away from a transit stop. That's number one. Inside that area, you've got 32 blocks, and each of our blocks is about 4 acres in size. It's the size of a block in Chicago or in the marina in San Francisco. So you've got 32 blocks, and about halfway between them, you've got a street that has cars going a little bit faster. So basically, there's 2 super blocks inside that area of half a mile by half a mile. Now, within each of the super blocks, which has 16 blocks, so imagine 16 blocks in Chicago or Marina or the West Village that you know, streets are wooners. So they are slow streets inspired by the streets in the Netherlands. We have a few different types, but they have, generally speaking, they have a merged right-of-way for pedestrians, cyclists, and cars. We would like the speed limit to be 10 to 15 miles an hour. There might be a regulatory change that is required to get that low, but that's where we would like to get to.
Really, I would have thought even lower. I feel like in Barcelona, it's like 6 or 7 miles an hour.
Really?
Crazy. Inside the superblocks, it's very like it's designed so pedestrians will be safe, right? So you got to. That's pretty slow. So
we might actually look into. I'm gonna go look into that because I mean, we have. Like, I think about this a lot, and I mean, in some sense, I'm really glad that the assembly. Because you said I've worked on it for 10 years. 8 of that was just buying the land. And then the last 2 years has really been 2.5 has been the design and so on. In some sense, I'm really glad that the assembly took that long because we had our first kid 4 years ago, and then we've had 2 more since then. And I think being a father just gave me much more visceral feel for things that I knew intellectually before then about how to design for kids. And so now I've given the team an official design goal of design the most child-friendly city in the world. But I think a lot about what would it take for me to let the kid wander on the street by themselves at different ages.
Who's the famous urbanist who says, a true city is where I can let go of my child's hand? Was that Jane Jacobs? Like somebody famous.
You know what? I've never heard that quote. That's an amazing quote. I'm going to write that down.
I should dig it up. But this is like a familiar concept in urbanism. Sometimes it's women. Sometimes it's feminist urbanism saying that women are an indicator species. If you design so that women are always comfortable, everybody else will be comfortable too. It's kind of the same thing with kids. Like if you design a city where a kid can wander safely, almost by definition, everybody else is safe too.
100%. And I think it's really useful to think of it that way. It's, by the way, also makes it really accessible to older people or people with disabilities, which is a big deal for us. So I'm actually really encouraged that Barcelona makes it work with as little as 6 miles an hour.
Don't verify that.
I will verify, and then I'm going to cause a nightmare for our team by pushing them more to make it even slower.
So I love this nested. So you have the one block that's got a bunch of parcels on it, and then you get 16 of those. That's a super block. And then you have 2 of these super blocks stacked on top of each other. You're calling that a neighborhood. That's within these half-mile boundaries.
That's right.
And then it says 3 to 7 of these neighborhoods clumped together gives you a district. So you have sort of nested like block, super block neighborhood. And to me, one of the most exciting things about all this, I mean, all of this is like urbanist dream. I mean, this is really just like it's just like all the best stuff. But like one of the most exciting things to me is that the neighborhood level, 2 super blocks stacked on side of each other, each neighborhood will have retail and a school in the center of it. That is so huge. That's huge for a million different reasons, but just talk through some of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that went into that decision. And again, it's one of the decisions that I'm most proud of that we made on the team because, I mean, the contrast that you're reacting to, I think, is in most new American developments, the school goes on the shitty parcel by the freeway.
If you get a school at all.
At the edge of the city. If you get a school at all.
Because everybody is going to drive to it, right? I mean, that's just...
Exactly.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. Tune back in Friday to listen to Jan and I discuss transit and walkability, permitting, jobs, much, much more. There is a lot more to dig into, so I will see you Friday.